12,000 bushels of golden wheat. That was Clara Jennings's entire livelihood, sitting in 12 semi-trucks, rejected. Wayne Cutler, the local elevator boss, looked her in the eye and condemned her harvest as worthless feed. It was a calculated move to bankrupt her and steal her family's land. He thought a grieving widow would break and sell her farm for pennies. He was wrong. What Clara did next, inside a dusty, abandoned dairy barn, didn't just save her farm, it made her a millionaire. The dust swirling around the massive concrete silos of the Tri-State Cooperative in Grafton, North Dakota, tasted like diesel exhaust and crushed dreams. It was early October, and the biting wind sweeping down from the Canadian border carried the bitter promise of an early winter. Clara Jennings sat behind the wheel of her dented Ford F-250, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. Behind her, idling in a line that stretched down the gravel access road, were 12 contracted semi-trucks. Their hoppers were packed to the brim with 12,000 bushels of hard red spring wheat. It was Clara's first harvest alone. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away from a sudden heart attack just 7 months prior, leaving her with 400 acres of prime Red River Valley dirt, a mountain of equipment debt, and a gaping hole in her chest that she had tried to fill with relentless, back-breaking labor. She had spent the last 3 weeks living in the cab of her John Deere combine, surviving on thermos coffee and sheer, panicked adrenaline. This wheat was her salvation. At $6.40 a bushel, the payout would be just enough to clear the crushing balloon payment due at First Dakota National Bank. By November 1st, it would secure her home for another year. The scale house light flashed green. Clara pulled her pickup forward, signaling the first semi, driven by an old family friend named Hank Peterson, to roll onto the massive steel weigh scales. Inside the glass-paneled office sat Wayne Cutler. Wayne was a man who looked like he had been poured into his stiff, immaculate Carhartt jacket, a jacket that had never seen a grease stain or a drop of hydraulic fluid. He was the regional manager for Tri-State, holding a localized monopoly over the grain trade in a 70-mile radius. If you didn't sell to Wayne, you didn't sell at all. Transporting bulk grain any further by truck would eat up the narrow profit margins that kept farmers like Clara afloat. Clara stepped out into the cold air, zipping up her coat. She watched the long mechanical probe lower from the overhead gantry, plunging deep into the golden sea of wheat in Hank's trailer to pull a core sample. The vacuum tube sucked the grain into the testing room, where it would be graded for moisture, protein, and test weight. She walked into the scale house. It smelled of stale Folgers, coffee, and ozone from the running computers. "Morning, Wayne," Clara said, forcing a polite smile. "Beautiful yield this year. We're pushing 60 bushels to the acre. Thomas would have been proud." Wayne didn't look up from his digital moisture meter. He slowly poured Clara's sample into the hopper of the grading machine. The device whirred, spitting out a small paper receipt. Wayne pulled it off, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and sighed. It was a practiced, theatrical sigh. "I'm sorry, Clara," Wayne said, his voice dripping with a faux sympathy that made her stomach turn. "I can't take this. I can't take any of it." Clara froze. The hum of the idling trucks outside seemed to fade into a deafening silence. "Excuse me, what do you mean you can't take it? The moisture is too high, and the falling number is a disaster," Wayne replied, tapping the paper. "Plus, I'm seeing visual signs of vomitoxin. You've got a bad fungal infection here, Clara. If I dump this into my silos, it'll contaminate 100,000 bushels of export-grade wheat. It's feed-grade at best. I might be able to give you $1.50 a bushel, but frankly, my feed bins are full." "Vomitoxin," Clara's voice spiked in disbelief. "Wayne, we haven't had rain in 3 weeks. The fields have been bone dry since the dough stage. There is 0 chance of a fungal bloom, and the moisture was testing at 13% right out of the combine." "My machines say different, Clara," Wayne said, crossing his arms. He finally looked her in the eye, and what Clara saw there sent a chill down her spine. There was no pity. There was a cold, calculating victory. "I know it's been tough since Thomas passed. Maybe this operation is just too much for one person to handle. You should think about your options. I hear Apex Land Holdings is making very generous cash offers for distressed properties. Clara's breath hitched. Apex Land Holdings. They were the massive corporate conglomerate buying up family farms across the state, consolidating them into sterile, mega operations. "Run the test again," Clara demanded, her voice trembling with rising fury. "The test is final," Wayne snapped, his polite veneer vanishing. "Move the trucks, Clara. You're holding up the line." She stood there for an agonizing second, the weight of the rejection crashing down on her shoulders. $1.50 a bushel wouldn't even cover the diesel fuel and the seed costs. It meant default. It meant losing the farmhouse where her children had taken their first steps. With her jaw clenched, Clara turned on her heel and walked out of the scale house. She climbed onto the running board of Hank's semi. "What's the hold-up, Clara?" Hank asked, rolling down his window, chewing on a toothpick. "Turn them around, Hank," Clara said, her voice hollow but resolute. "All of them. We're taking it back to the farm." Hank stared at her, horrified. "Clara, you don't have the bin space for 12,000 bushels. We'll have to dump it on the ground. The rats and the weather will ruin it in a month." "I don't care! Turn them around!" she screamed, the desperation finally cracking her voice. As the convoy of heavy trucks lumbered in a wide U-turn, kicking up a massive cloud of dust, Clara looked back at the glass window of the scale house. Wayne Cutler was standing there, watching them leave, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. Dumping 12,000 bushels of premium wheat onto the concrete floor of her old, uninsulated Quonset hut was a logistical nightmare that took 14 grueling hours. The dust was suffocating, coating Clara's skin, hair, and lungs. She stood at the end of a portable grain auger, guiding the golden cascade into massive, shimmering piles that looked like mountains of gold, but felt like monuments to her impending bankruptcy. By the time the last truck pulled away in the dead of night, Clara was physically broken. She sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in the dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the corrugated fiberglass skylights. The smell of the raw grain, earthy, sweet, and perfectly dry, mocked her. She scooped up a handful. The kernels were plump, hard, and flawless. There was no chalky white residue, no shriveled husks. Wayne had lied. But why? The next morning, driven by a restless, gnawing suspicion, Clara drove her pickup into the nearby town of Langdon. She needed a cashier's check to pay the independent truckers, completely draining her emergency operating fund. After leaving the bank, the sheer exhaustion caught up with her. She pulled into the parking lot of the Red River Diner, desperate for a cup of black coffee and a moment to think. The diner was mostly empty, smelling of bacon grease and stale maple syrup. Clara slid into a high-backed booth in the far corner, hidden behind a row of artificial ferns. She stared blankly at the laminated menu, her mind racing with desperate, impossible calculations on how to stop the bank foreclosure. The bell above the diner door jingled. "Just put us in the back, Brenda. We need some privacy," a familiar, arrogant voice requested. Clara froze. It was Wayne Cutler. She shrank down into her seat. Heavy footsteps approached, stopping at the booth directly behind hers. The high wooden partition was the only thing separating them. "You're sure she's tapped out?" a second, much smoother voice asked. The man sounded out of place, too polished, too corporate for Langdon. "I'm telling you, Greg, the woman is finished," Wayne chuckled, the sound grating against Clara's nerves. "I turned away her entire harvest yesterday. Claimed it was laced with vomitoxin. She had to haul it all the way back and dump it in a tin shed. It'll rot before she can find an alternative buyer." Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Greg. That had to be Greg Tolliver, the regional acquisition director for Apex Land Holdings. "And the bank?" Greg asked, a clinking sound indicating he was stirring his coffee. "David Henderson over at First Dakota is on board," Wayne replied casually, delivering a revelation that felt like a physical blow to Clara's stomach. "He's calling in her note on the first. No extensions, no restructuring. Once she defaults, Apex swoops in and buys the 400 acres at auction for pennies on the dollar. You get your prime real estate, and my cooperative gets the exclusive contract to handle all of Apex's regional yields. Win-win. Just make sure she doesn't find a loophole," Greg warned. If she ships that grain to the Minneapolis mills, she could secure enough capital to make the payment. She can't, Wayne scoffed. She doesn't have the capital to hire long-haul freight. Even if she did, freight rates are through the roof right now. By the time it gets to Minneapolis, she'd lose money on the transport. She's isolated, she's broke, and she's out of time. The Jennings farm is as good as ours. Clara sat paralyzed in her booth, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. It wasn't just a tough break. It wasn't a strict grading standard. It was a targeted, orchestrated conspiracy. Wayne, the corporate vultures at Apex, and even her own local banker were colluding to steal the land her husband's grandfather had homesteaded a century ago. They saw her as weak, a vulnerable, grieving widow who would simply fold her hands and surrender when the pressure got too high. A single tear tracked through the dust on Clara's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. The despair that had been suffocating her for the last 24 hours rapidly began to crystallize into something entirely different. It turned into a searing, white-hot rage. She waited until Wayne and Greg ordered their breakfasts before silently slipping out of the booth. She walked out the front door, the bell jingling cheerfully overhead, stepping into the biting October air. She didn't drive home in a panic. She drove home with a terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. Wayne was right about one thing. She couldn't afford to ship raw commodity grain to Minneapolis. The system was designed to keep the farmer at the bottom of the food chain, dependent on the local elevator, and at the mercy of bulk commodity prices. So, Clara thought, staring at the vast expanse of her fields through the windshield, I won't play by their rules. I will break the board. The first thing Clara did when she got back to the farm was take a 5-pound sample of her wheat. She drove to a FedEx drop box in the next county over, mailing it overnight to an independent, state-certified agricultural laboratory in Fargo. For 3 days, she lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the results, pacing the floorboards of the empty farmhouse. When the email finally pinged on her laptop, she opened the attached PDF with trembling hands. Protein, 14.8%. Moisture, 12.1%. Falling number, 380. Vomitoxin, 0.00 parts per million. Grade, premium number 1. It wasn't just good wheat, it was spectacular wheat. The kind of high-protein, perfectly balanced grain that artisanal bakers prayed for. Clara printed the certificate. She could have taken it to the authorities. She could have sued Wayne Cutler and the co-op. But lawsuits took years, and she had exactly 21 days before the bank foreclosed. She needed cash, and she needed it now. She walked out of the house, bypassing the Quonset hut, where the mountains of grain sat waiting, and walked toward the oldest building on the property. It was a massive, weathered red dairy barn, built in the 1920s. The dairy cows had been sold off decades ago by her father-in-law, and the building had since been relegated to storing junk, broken tractor implements, rusted wire, and stacks of rotting wooden pallets. Clara pulled open the heavy sliding door. The hinges shrieked in protest. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing the gloom. At the very back of the barn, sitting under a heavy canvas tarp, was a relic from the past. Clara pulled the tarp away, coughing as a cloud of dust plumed into the air. It was an antique cast-iron stone burr flour mill. Thomas's great-grandfather had used it during the Great Depression. When the local mills had shut down or price-gouged the farmers, he had ground his own wheat into flour and traded it with the neighbors for meat and eggs. It was a beautiful, hulking piece of machinery, powered by a massive leather belt, driven by a tractor PTO, power takeoff. Clara ran her hand over the cold, rusted iron of the hopper. An insane, impossible idea began to bloom in her mind. Wayne Cutler paid farmers $6 for a 60-pound bushel of wheat. That was roughly 10 cents a pound. He then shipped it to corporate mills, who turned it into flour and sold it in grocery stores for $2 a pound. The middleman took 95% of the value. What if I eliminate the middleman, she thought, her pulse quickening. If she had 12,000 bushels, That meant she had 700 citri, 20,000 pounds of premium wheat. If she could mill it herself and sell it directly to consumers and bakeries for even $1.50 a pound, her harvest wasn't worth the $76,000 the co-op was offering. It was worth over $1 million. Clara rushed back to the house. She dug through the filing cabinets in Thomas's office, pulling out every credit card they possessed. Between 4 cards, she had about $35,000 in available credit. It was the absolute last of her financial lifelines. If she failed, she would face personal bankruptcy and ruin. She sat at the computer and began furiously researching. The antique stone mill in the barn was a beautiful museum piece, but it would take a year to grind 12,000 bushels. She needed industrial capacity. She needed modern equipment. She found a company in Kansas called Heartland Milling Systems that sold commercial-grade stone mills and automated sifting equipment. She dialed the number, her hands shaking. "Heartland Milling, this is Marcus," a voice answered. "Wait, Marcus is a forbidden name. Correction. Heartland Milling, this is Calvin," a friendly voice answered. "Calvin, my name is Clara Jennings. I need a commercial stone ground flour mill, capable of processing at least 1,000 pounds an hour. And I need a bagging line. Do you have anything in stock?" "Well, ma'am, we usually build to order," Calvin replied, sounding surprised. "Lead time is about 12 weeks. "I don't have 12 weeks, Calvin. I have 2, Clara said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unyielding steel. "I will pay shipping expedited. Do you have a demo unit, a refurbished model, anything?" There was a pause on the line. "Actually, we had a buyer in Colorado default on an order last week. We have a fully assembled 24-inch dual stone mill, complete with a pneumatic sifter and a semi-automatic bagging station. It's sitting on 3 pallets on our loading dock right now. But ma'am, it's $28,000. "I'll take it," Clara said without missing a beat. "Put it on my visa." Over the next 4 days, Clara worked like a woman possessed. She hired Ben Matheson, a retired farmhand who used to work for Thomas's father, to help her. Together they gutted the old dairy barn. They dragged out decades of scrap metal, pressure-washed the concrete floors until they gleamed, and sealed the walls with heavy white agricultural plastic to create a sanitary, food-safe environment. When the 18-wheeler from Kansas backed up to the barn, lowering the massive, gleaming stainless steel and cast-iron milling equipment onto the concrete pad, Clara knew there was no going back. She had bet the farm, her future, and her husband's legacy on a desperate gamble. She was no longer just a wheat farmer, subject to the whims of corrupt elevator managers. She was the founder of Whispering Pines Milling Company, and she was going to war. Getting the equipment unloaded was only the beginning of a nightmare that tested the absolute limits of Clara's endurance. The mill required a 3-phase electrical drop, something the old dairy barn hadn't been wired for since its construction. Clara had to call in a massive favor from Wilson Jensen, an independent agricultural electrician who had gone to high school with her late husband, Thomas. Wilson worked through the night, running thick, black conduit from the main farm transformer, stringing it across the frosty rafters of the barn by the light of a single halogen work lamp. By the time the power was connected, they had exactly 16 days left before the November 1st bank deadline. The first test run was a disaster. Clara and Ben Matheson, the retired farmhand she had hired, hauled a 500-pound tote of the stored wheat from the Quonset hut. Using a skid steer, they hoisted it over the mill's stainless steel hopper, pulled the release valve, and fired up the machine. The noise was deafening, a deep, violent vibration that rattled the barn's time-worn timber frame. But instead of soft, white flour, the pneumatic sifters spat out a scorched, coarse meal that smelled of burnt popcorn. "The stones are too tight," Ben yelled over the mechanical roar, his face smeared with grease. "We're cooking the starches before they even hit the sifter." Clara's heart sank as she scooped up a handful of the ruined flour. It was useless. At this rate, she was going to incinerate her own harvest. They spent the next 24 hours doing nothing but dialing in the massive 24-inch granite millstones. It was an agonizing process of micro-adjustments. Too loose, and the bran wouldn't separate from the endosperm, leaving a gritty, unpleasant texture. too tight, and the friction heat would destroy the delicate enzymes and proteins that made her wheat so valuable. Finally, at 3 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday morning, the pitch of the machine shifted. It settled into a rhythmic, steady hum. Clara held a brown paper test bag under the bagging chute and pulled the lever. A cascade of pale cream-colored flour poured out. It didn't smell burnt. It smelled faintly sweet, nutty, and vibrant. She plunged her bare hands into the bag. The powder was incredibly fine, like silk slipping through her fingers, yet it retained a microscopic fleck of the germ that gave artisan stone-ground flour its legendary character. "We did it," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "Ben, look at this, it's perfect." Ben, leaning heavily against a wooden support beam, wiped his brow with a rag and grinned. "It's the finest flour I've ever seen, Clara. Now we just have to do that 239,000 more times." They established a brutal, unyielding schedule. Ben ran the skid steer, constantly shuttling raw grain from the Quonset hut to the barn. Clara managed the milling floor. She monitored the stone temperature, emptied the bran catchers, and operated the semi-automatic bagging line. She had ordered 1,000 heavy-duty, 50-pound craft paper bags. With no time or money for fancy graphic design, she had gone to a local craft store in Langdon and bought a massive custom-made rubber ink stamp. Every single bag that came off the line had to be manually stamped with black ink. Whispering Pines Heritage Milling. 100% hard red spring wheat, unbleached, tight. By day 4 of the operation, her hands were cracked and bleeding from the dry flour dust. Her shoulders ached with a deep, throbbing pain from lifting and stacking 50-pound sacks onto wooden shipping pallets. She was sleeping in 4-hour shifts on a cot, set up in the corner of the barn, too paranoid to leave the machinery unattended. They were producing roughly 3,000 pounds of premium flour a day, but an agonizing reality was beginning to set in. A barn full of beautifully packaged high-protein flour was absolutely worthless if she didn't have a buyer. And she was running out of time. She needed $50,000 by the end of the month, or the bank would seize it all. Clara left Ben in charge of the milling line, loaded 2 tons of flour into an enclosed horse trailer she'd hitched to her F250, and drove 6 hours southeast to Minneapolis. She didn't target grocery stores. The retail shelf space game was controlled by massive food conglomerates. It would take months to get a single SKU approved, let alone paid for. Instead, she targeted the high-end artisan bakeries, the places that charged $12 for a loaf of sourdough and boasted about their ingredient sourcing. Her first stop was a trendy, glass-fronted bakery in the North Loop. The manager, a young man with a waxed mustache, barely looked at her sample bag before dismissing her. "We already have a contract with a national supplier. Besides, we only use Italian 00 flour." The second, third, and fourth bakeries gave her similar variations of the same rejection. Some were polite, some were condescending, but the result was identical. No one wanted to take a risk on an unknown, unproven widow from North Dakota with hand-stamped bags. By 4 p.m., a cold drizzle had started to fall over the city. Clara sat in the cab of her truck, staring at the steering wheel, fighting back tears of sheer exhaustion. She had exactly 8 days left. The weight of her debt felt like a physical anvil resting on her chest. She pulled out her notebook, looking at the final name on her list, Hearth and Crumb. It was a massive wholesale artisan bakery that supplied high-end restaurants and boutique hotels across the entire Twin Cities metro area. It was owned by Dominic Russo, a notoriously temperamental master baker who had recently been featured in a national culinary magazine. Clara drove the truck to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. She didn't go to the front door. She backed her heavy trailer directly up to the open loading dock, where men in flour-dusted aprons were pushing rolling racks of cooling bread. She grabbed a 50-pound sack, hoisted it onto her shoulder, ignoring the shooting pain in her lower back, and marched up the metal stairs, right past the protesting dock foreman. "Hey, lady, you can't be back here," the foreman shouted. "I need to see Dominic Russo," Clara demanded. dropping the heavy sack onto a stainless steel prep table with a deafening thud that silenced the entire kitchen. A tall, broad-shouldered man with flour caked into his dark beard stepped out from behind a massive commercial spiral mixer. He looked at Clara, then down at the hand-stamped brown paper bag. "I'm Russo," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Who are you and why are you throwing things on my prep tables?" "My name is Clara Jennings. I own Whispering Pines Milling," Clara said, her voice shaking, but her eyes locked dead onto his. "I read your interview in Bake magazine. You complained that commercial flour is dead, that the modern roller milling process strips the character and the flavor out of the wheat, forcing you to overhydrate just to get a decent crumb structure." Dominic crossed his massive arms. So, I have 12,000 bushels of single-origin, hard red spring wheat, grown in the Red River Valley. Protein content is 14.8%. Falling number is 380. And it was milled exactly 36 hours ago on 24-inch grand stone burrs. It hasn't been bleached, it hasn't been bromated, and it hasn't been sitting in a silo for a year losing its volatile oils. Dominic stared at her, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking through his irritation. He pulled a utility knife from his apron and slashed open the top of the bag. He plunged his hand in, pulling out a fistful of the pale, cream-colored flour. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the microscopic texture of the stone grind. Then, to Clara's surprise, he brought it to his nose and inhaled deeply. His eyebrows shot up. "This smells alive." "It is," Clara said. "Take 10 pounds. Bake with it tonight. If it isn't the best flour you've ever put through your ovens, I'll turn my truck around and you'll never see me again. If it is, I have 2 tons sitting out in that trailer and 40 more back at my farm." Dominic looked at the raw exhaustion in Clara's eyes, then back at the flour. "Fine, but I'm warning you, my starters are aggressive. If this wheat doesn't have the gluten structure you claim, it's going to collapse into soup." Clara spent the night sleeping in the cab of her truck in the bakery's parking lot. The freezing rain drummed against the roof, making it impossible to find any real rest. At 5 a.m., a sharp rap on her window jolted her awake. It was Dominic. He was holding a massive, dark-crusted bowl of sourdough. He didn't say a word. He just cracked it open right there in the cold morning air. The sound of the crust shattering was like a shotgun blast of pure, caramelized perfection. Inside, the crumb was a masterpiece, glossy, open, and webbed with massive air pockets. The aroma of wild yeast and deep, complex wheat filled the damp air. "The hydration tolerance is insane," Dominic said, staring at the bread as if it were a religious artifact. "It took 85% water and didn't even flinch. The oven spring was explosive. Clara, this is the best flour I've handled in 20 years. Oha." Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 6 months. "How much do you have in the trailer?" Dominic asked. 4,000 pounds. "I'll take it all," Dominic said, pulling a checkbook from his pocket. "And I want a standing order for 8,000 pounds a week. I'll pay $1.20 a pound. Wholesale. Can you deliver?" Clara did the math in her head. 8,000 pounds at $1.20 was $9,600 a week. The 4,000 pounds today would give her $4,800. It wasn't the 50,000 she needed to save the farm by November 1st, but Dominic wasn't finished. "I'm calling the head purchaser for the North Star Restaurant Group," Dominic continued, writing out the check. "They supply 60 premium restaurants in the Midwest. They've been looking for a local, farm-to-table grain supplier for their pasta and baking programs. If I tell them this is the new standard, they'll buy everything you can produce." By noon that day, Clara was sitting in a corporate office in downtown Minneapolis. With Dominic Russo's aggressive endorsement, the North Star Restaurant Group drafted a letter of intent. They wanted 30,000 pounds of flour delivered by October 30th to stock their central distribution hub for the winter season. They agreed to wire a $50,000 advance the moment the pallets hit their loading dock. Clara had her lifeline. All she had to do was get home, mill 30,000 pounds of flour in 5 days, and deliver it. She didn't know that Wayne Cutler had already noticed the lights burning all night in her barn. News travels faster than prairie fire in a town like Langdon. The fact that Clara Jennings hadn't filed for bankruptcy combined with the massive FedEx freight trucks that had started delivering wooden pallets and packaging supplies to her farm, had finally caught the attention of the Tri-State Cooperative. Wayne Cutler sat in his immaculate office, staring out the window at the towering concrete silos. He had just gotten off the phone with David Henderson, the branch manager at First Dakota National Bank. "She hasn't missed a beat, Wayne." David's voice had buzzed through the phone, thick with anxiety. "I drove by her place yesterday. She's got a commercial exhaust vent blowing flour dust out the side of the old dairy barn. She's milling it. If she somehow makes the November 1st balloon payment, I can't legally foreclose. Apex Land Holdings is going to pull their regional accounts from my branch if we don't deliver this property." "Relax, David," Wayne had replied, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. "A woman with a single skid steer in a barn can't process enough volume to make 50 grand in a week. She'll fail." But Wayne wasn't a man who left things to chance. The Apex deal included a massive kickback for him personally, a consulting fee that would buy him a winter home in Arizona. Clara Jennings was a stubborn weed standing in the way of his retirement, and it was time to pull her out by the roots. It was October 27th. Clara and Ben were operating on the absolute edge of human exhaustion. The mill had been running non-stop for 72 hours. Pallets of stamped, 50-pound bags were stacked to the ceiling of the barn. They were only 8,000 pounds away from fulfilling the North Star Restaurant Group's order. At 2 a.m., the massive diesel generator Wilson Jensen had rented them to supplement the farm's power suddenly sputtered. The rhythmic, deep vibration of the millstones began to pitch downward, a dying mechanical groan. The overhead lights flickered and died, plunging the barn into terrifying darkness. "Ben, did we run out of diesel?" Clara shouted, grabbing a heavy Maglite flashlight from the packing table. "No way, I filled the tank at midnight," Ben yelled back, the beam of his own flashlight cutting through the swirling flour dust. "Shut the hopper valves. If the stones stop while full of grain, they'll lock up and we'll have to tear the whole housing apart." Clara sprinted to the mill, blindly reaching for the heavy steel shutoff levers, her muscles screaming in protest. She managed to close the gates just as the massive stones ground to a complete halt. The silence that followed was suffocating. "The generator's out back," Ben said, his voice tense. "I'll go check the lines." "I'm coming with you," Clara said. They stepped out the side door of the barn into the freezing, wind-whipped night. The farm was dead quiet. Clara swung her Maglite toward the massive generator sitting on a trailer pad. The heavy, steel-braided fuel line that connected the external diesel tank to the generator's intake manifold had been completely severed. Diesel fuel was pooling onto the dirt, soaking into the frost. This wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a deliberate, violent cut. "Someone was just here," Ben hissed, instinctively grabbing a heavy steel wrench from the toolbox in the generator trailer. Suddenly, Clara's farm dog, a massive German shepherd named Buster, erupted into a vicious, snarling fit of barking near the Quonset hut, where the remaining raw wheat was stored. "The grain!" Clara screamed. If the saboteur couldn't stop the mill, the next logical step was to destroy the raw material. If someone dumped a gallon of bleach or motor oil into the grain pile, the entire harvest would be condemned. Clara and Ben sprinted across the dark yard, their boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. As they rounded the corner of the massive tin structure, Clara's flashlight beam caught a figure scrambling up the side of the portable grain auger that led to the open roof vent of the hut. The figure was wearing a dark hoodie and carrying a heavy, unmarked plastic jug. "Hey!" Ben roared, his voice echoing like thunder across the empty fields. He threw the heavy steel wrench. It didn't hit the man, but it slammed violently against the metal side of the auger, with a deafening clang. The figure panicked. He lost his footing on the slick metal rungs, dropping the plastic jug. It hit the ground and shattered, sending a noxious wave of ammonia stinging into the air. The saboteur scrambled down the rest of the way, hitting the dirt and sprinting toward a pickup truck parked without its lights on at the edge of the county road. Clara didn't freeze. The rage that had been simmering since the day at the elevator boiled over. She ran toward the road, memorizing the shape of the vehicle in the moonlight. It was a newer model, Chevy Silverado. As the truck's engine roared to life and the headlights finally flicked on, she caught a fleeting glimpse of the license plate and the customized chrome mud flaps. She knew that truck. It belonged to Cody Miller, a 22-year-old kid who worked as a scale operator for Wayne Cutler at the Tri-State Cooperative. Wayne had sent his own employee in the dead of night to poison her grain. Ben came panting up behind her as the truck's tail lights vanished down the highway. "Did you see who it was?" "I saw enough," Clara breathed, her voice eerily calm. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, tactical absolute. "Ben, how long will it take to splice that fuel line and bleed the generator?" "An hour, maybe 2, Ben said, wiping his mouth. "Clara, we need to call the sheriff. This is a felony." "The sheriff won't do anything tonight. It's my word against a kid who will claim he was asleep in his bed," Clara said, turning back toward the barn. "And if we stop to file police reports, we lose a day of mailing. If we lose a day, we miss the delivery window from Minneapolis. If we miss the delivery window, Wayne Cutler wins." "So what do?" Ben asked. "We fix the generator. We lock the farm gate, and we mill the rest of that grain if we have to do it by hand," Clara said, her eyes reflecting the beam of the flashlight like polished steel. "Wayne Cutler wants a war. Fine. But I'm going to make sure he's the one who loses his livelihood." For the rest of the night, Clara and Ben worked with a manic, desperate energy. While Ben repaired the severed fuel line, Clara backed her own truck up to the Quonset hut, letting Buster the German Shepherd off his leash to patrol the perimeter. She sat in the cab, with her husband's 12-gauge shotgun resting across her lap, watching the tree line until the generator roared back to life. She had survived the night, but the real fight was scheduled for the morning of October 30th, inside the lobby of First Dakota National Bank. By the evening of October 28th, the old dairy barn looked like a commercial warehouse. 600 heavy craft paper bags, each perfectly stamped and weighing exactly 50 pounds, sat meticulously stacked and shrink-wrapped on heavy wooden pallets. 30,000 pounds of premium, stone-ground flour. The antique mill was finally silent, its massive granite stones radiating a gentle, dying heat into the freezing barn air. Clara leaned against the stainless steel bagging chute, her arms trembling so violently she could barely hold her thermos of coffee. She had slept a total of 9 hours in the past 5 days. Her jeans were stiff with dried sweat and flour paste, and her eyes were bloodshot, haunted by the adrenaline that had kept her moving past the point of human collapse. Ben Matheson sat on an overturned bucket, too exhausted to even speak, staring blankly at the mountains of their labor. "We did it, Ben," Clara whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "We milled it, boss," Ben replied, wiping his flour-coated face with a rag. "But we still have to move it, and the radio says an Alberta clipper is sweeping down from Canada tonight. We're looking at 8 inches of snow and 40-mile-an-hour wind gusts by midnight." Clara looked out the barn window. The sky to the north was already a bruised, violent purple. An early winter blizzard in North Dakota wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a lethal force of nature that shut down interstate highways and buried semi-trucks in massive drifts. But she had a delivery window in Minneapolis the next morning, and the bank deadline was less than 72 hours away. "I rented a 26-foot international box truck in Langdon," Clara said, pushing herself off the chute. "Hank Peterson is driving it out here right now. We load it and I drive through the night. If I leave by 8 o'clock, I can beat the worst of the whiteout before I hit Fargo." When Hank arrived with the massive yellow rental truck, the first snowflakes were already beginning to fall. Dry, hard crystals that stung the skin like pulverized glass. For 2 agonizing hours, Ben operated the skid steer, lifting the heavy pallets of flour into the back of the truck, while Clara and Hank used a manual pallet jack to muscle them into place. Every muscle in Clara's back screamed in protest. Her hands, wrapped in heavy leather work gloves, bled from the cracked skin across her knuckles. By the time the heavy rear door rolled shut and the latch clicked into place, the wind was howling across the plains, tearing the last dead leaves from the oak trees lining the driveway. "Clara, you can't drive in this," Hank pleaded, pulling his collar up against the biting wind. "The DOT is already advising no travel on Interstate 29. The black ice is going to be treacherous, and that truck is carrying 15 tons of dead weight. If you slide into a ditch, they won't be able to get a tow truck out to you until tomorrow afternoon. If I don't go, I lose the farm, Clara said, climbing up into the high cab of the International. She rolled down the window, looking down at the two men who had helped her pull off a miracle. I'll keep it at 40 miles an hour. I'll chain the tires if I have to. Just watch the farm while I'm gone, Hank. Don't let anyone near those silos. The drive south was a waking nightmare. As Clara crossed the county line, the Alberta Clipper hit with its full, terrifying fury. The headlights of the box truck reflected off a solid, hypnotic wall of driving snow. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The massive truck shuddered and swayed under the brutal crosswinds, the rear dual tires fighting for traction on the rapidly freezing asphalt. For 6 hours, Clara white-knuckled the massive steering wheel, her shoulders locked in a state of permanent tension. The heater blasted against the windshield, struggling to melt the ice that was rapidly encasing the wiper blades. She passed jackknifed semi-trucks and abandoned cars sitting in the ditches, their hazard lights blinking weakly through the blizzard. Every instinct screamed at her to pull over, to find a motel, to rest. But the image of Wayne Cutler's smug face sitting in the diner, plotting her ruin, burned in her mind like a furnace. She kept her foot on the accelerator, pushing the heavy machine through the storm. Dawn broke over the Twin Cities not with sunlight, but with a flat, gray illumination that revealed a city paralyzed by snow. But Clara had made it. At exactly 8:15 a.m., she backed the massive box truck up to the bustling loading dock of the North Star Restaurant Group's central distribution warehouse. The bay doors rolled up, and a crew of dock workers, bundled in heavy coats, stared in shock at the snow-encased truck that had somehow survived the journey. The head purchaser, a sharply dressed woman named Sarah, stepped out onto the dock holding a clipboard. She watched as Clara, looking like a ghost, dragged through hell, climbed down from the cab. Sarah ordered a random bag to be pulled from the pallets and tested in their on-site QA kitchen. Only 30 minutes later, Sarah returned, a look of profound respect on her face. Dominic Russo wasn't exaggerating, Sarah said, signing the bottom of a heavy invoice. The protein matrix is incredible, and the flavor profile is unlike anything we currently source. You delivered exactly what you promised, Mrs. Jennings, in the middle of a historic blizzard, no less. The agreement was payment on delivery, Clara said, her voice shaking with exhaustion. And we honor our agreements, Sarah replied, handing Clara a heavy envelope. This is a certified cashier's check for $50,000, drawn from our corporate account. It's clear and ready for deposit. We also want to discuss a permanent, year-round contract, but I suggest you get a hotel and sleep first. You look like you're going to drop dead on my loading dock. Clara took the envelope. She opened it, staring at the embossed seal and the heavy black numbers. $50,000 and 0 hundredths. It was more money than she had seen in 5 years. It was the exact amount she needed to stop the foreclosure. She didn't feel joy or relief or triumph. She only felt a cold, sharp, predatory anticipation. She wasn't going to a hotel. She was going back to North Dakota. She had an appointment at the bank. November 1st arrived with a bitter, brittle cold that froze the Red River solid. Inside the pristine, mahogany-paneled conference room of First Dakota National Bank in Langdon, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and freshly brewed espresso. David Henderson, the branch manager, sat at the head of the heavy oak table, nervously straightening a stack of thick legal documents. To his right sat Wayne Cutler, wearing his trademark stiff Carhartt jacket, a look of absolute arrogant victory plastered across his face. Next to Wayne sat Greg Tolliver from Apex Land Holdings, tapping a gold Mont Blanc pen against his leather portfolio. The digital clock on the wall read 9:05 a.m. "She's defaulting," Greg said smoothly, checking his Rolex. "But the balloon payment was due at the opening of business. She isn't here, David. Let's execute the foreclosure deed so my people can begin surveying the property this afternoon." David wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Technically, she has until the end of the business day. She's broke, David. Wayne interrupted with a cruel chuckle. I drove past her place yesterday. Her truck wasn't even there. She probably packed up whatever she could fit in a suitcase and fled the state. Just sign the transfer papers. Apex gets the land, the bank gets the defaulted note cleared from its books, and my cooperative gets the exclusive handling contract. We all win. David sighed, reaching for his pen. He placed the tip against the bottom line of the notice of default and intended sale. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open with such force that it slammed against the wall stopper, cracking the drywall. David jumped. Wayne and Greg spun around in their leather chairs. Clara Jennings stood in the doorway. She was wearing her heavy worn canvas barn coat, her work boots leaving wet tracks of melting snow on the plush corporate carpet. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy braid, dark circles under her eyes. But she didn't look defeated. She looked like a general walking onto a conquered battlefield. "Good morning, gentlemen," Clara said, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. She walked deliberately toward the table, ignoring the empty chair offered to her, and stood directly across from Wayne Cutler. "Clara," David stammered, his face flushing crimson. We didn't expect you. The deadline—" "I'm fully aware of the deadline, David," Clara said coolly. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the heavy envelope, and tossed it onto the center of the oak table. $50,000. Certified cashier's check. That clears the balloon payment, covers the interest penalty, and brings the mortgage current for the next 12 months. The Jennings farm is no longer in default. The room plunged into a stunned, breathless silence. David slowly picked up the envelope, pulling out the check. His eyes widened behind his glasses. This is from the North Star Restaurant Group. How in God's name did you—" "She's bluffing," Wayne snapped, standing up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His face had gone purple with rage. "That's fraudulent. She doesn't have 50 grand. Her entire harvest was infected with vomitoxin. I rejected it myself." "Did you, Wayne?" Clara asked, a razor-sharp smile playing at the corner of her lips. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, tossing it next to the check. "That is a certified state-stamped laboratory analysis from the independent AG lab in Fargo. Moisture, 12.1. Protein, 14.8. Vomitoxin, absolute 0. Grade 1 premium spring wheat." Wayne stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Greg Tolliver snatched the paper, reading it quickly, his polished demeanor instantly cracking as he realized the liability sitting in front of him. "You lied, Wayne," Clara continued, her voice rising, filling the room with an undeniable authority. "You fabricated a grain grading to intentionally bankrupt a local farmer so you could facilitate a corrupt land grab with Apex land holdings and secure a kickback. I heard you and Greg discussing it at the Red River Diner." "You can't prove that," Wayne shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "It's your word against mine. You're a hysterical widow making up fairy tales." "I don't need to prove the conversation," Clara said, stepping closer to the table, her eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. "Because I can prove the sabotage." Clara turned toward the hallway. "You can come in now, Sheriff." Sheriff Jim Boyd, a massive man who had served the county for 30 years, walked into the conference room. His hand was resting casually on his duty belt, but his eyes were locked dead onto Wayne Cutler. "What is this, Jim?" Wayne demanded, trying to project authority but failing miserably. "Since when does the sheriff act as muscle for a delinquent farmer?" "Since the farmer's neighbor, Wilson Jensen, brought me a very interesting young man a few hours ago," Sheriff Boyd said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "Cody Miller, your scale operator." Seems Wilson caught Cody spending a whole lot of cash at the bar last night. Wilson put some pressure on him, asked him why he was driving around Clara's farm at 2 in the morning a few nights ago. Wayne's face drained of all color. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor. Cody sang like a canary, Wayne. The sheriff continued. "He confessed that you paid him $500 cash to cut the fuel line on Clara's generator and dump a gallon of industrial ammonia into her grain bins to ruin her crop. We've got the severed line, the shattered jug, and his written confession." "He's lying. The kid is a junkie, he's making it up." Wayne panicked, backing away from the table. "Attempting to poison a commercial food supply is a Class B felony, Wayne," Sheriff Boyd said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. And conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines brings the FBI into it. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. As the heavy steel cuffs clicked shut around Wayne's wrists, Clara turned to look at Greg Tolliver. The corporate executive was already furiously packing his briefcase, trying to distance himself from the radioactive disaster unfolding in front of him. Apex Land Holdings is officially withdrawing its interest in this county, Greg muttered, refusing to make eye contact with Clara. We have no association with this man's independent actions. Run back to the city, Greg, Clara said softly, but with enough venom to make the executive freeze in his tracks. And tell your board of directors that the Red River Valley is no longer for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. Finally, Clara turned to David Henderson. The banker was shaking, his hands trembling as he held the $50,000 check. He knew that if Clara reported his collusion to the State Banking Commission, his career would be over. Process the check, David, Clara commanded, leaning over the table. And when I come back here next month to discuss a commercial expansion loan for my new milling facility, you are going to give me the lowest prime interest rate this bank has offered in 20 years. Do we understand each other? Yes, Clara, David whispered, staring at the table. Perfectly. Clara turned and walked out of the conference room. She walked out of the bank and stepped into the freezing, bright November sunlight. For the first time since her husband had died, the crushing weight on her chest was gone. She took a deep breath of the cold prairie air. Poor day, she hadn't just saved her farm. Fie, she had conquered her enemies, broken their system, and claimed her absolute independence. 3 years is a short time in the history of a century-old family farm, but for Clara Jennings, it was enough time to build an empire. The old, rusted Quonset hut was gone. In its place stood a massive, gleaming $3 million milling facility, clad in pristine white steel and towering above the surrounding wheat fields. The antique stone mill that had saved her from bankruptcy now sat perfectly restored in a glass display case in the lobby of the corporate offices of Whispering Pines Heritage Milling. Clara's gamble had paid off in ways she never could have imagined. The artisan baking world had exploded in popularity, and consumers were violently rejecting the hyper-processed, nutrient-dead flours of the massive commercial conglomerates. They wanted traceability. They wanted single-origin grains. They wanted the story of the resilient widow who ground her own wheat. Whispering Pines was no longer just supplying Dominic Russo and the North Star Restaurant Group. Clara's flour was stocked in the baking aisles of over 400 premium grocery stores, including national contracts with Whole Foods and artisanal markets from Chicago to Seattle. The hand-stamped brown paper bags had been replaced with beautiful, professionally designed packaging, but the promise remained the same: 100% hard red spring wheat, unbleached, stone-ground, unconquered. Clara had paid off the entirety of her farm's debt in 18 months. By year 3, her company's gross revenue crossed the $8 million mark. She was, by every definition of the word, a self-made millionaire. But Clara didn't hoard the wealth. She remembered what it felt like to be squeezed by the corporate monopolies. When the tri-state cooperative collapsed under the weight of federal investigations and massive fines following Wayne Cutler's conviction and imprisonment, Clara stepped in. She purchased the cooperative's towering concrete silos at a public auction, completely outbidding Apex Land Holdings, who had foolishly tried to return to the valley. She rebranded the silos as the Whispering Pines Independent Growers Co-op. Instead of paying farmers the bottom-barrel commodity rate, Clara offered contracts at a massive premium to any local farmer willing to transition to organic, heritage wheat cultivation. She provided the seeds, she provided the agronomy support, and she guaranteed them a price that allowed them to pay off their own debts and keep their family lands out of corporate hands. Ben Matheson was promoted to head of milling operations, overseeing a staff of 25 full-time, well-paid local employees. Hank Peterson became her chief logistics director, managing a fleet of 10 brand-new semi-trucks bearing the Whispering Pines logo. One crisp October afternoon, Clara stood on the catwalk near the top of her massive new silos. She looked out over the Red River Valley. The fields were a brilliant, unbroken sea of gold, waiting for the combines. The air smelled of diesel, dry earth, and the sweet, nutty scent of freshly milled flour venting from her factory below. She rested her hand on the cold steel railing, feeling the deep, powerful hum of the massive industrial stones grinding the harvest. She thought of her late husband, Thomas. She thought of Wayne Cutler sitting in a federal penitentiary. And she thought of the terrifying night. She had dumped her rejected harvest into a tin shed, convinced her life was over. They had tried to bury her. They had rejected her harvest, manipulated the scales, and tried to steal her legacy. But they hadn't realized that when you bury a seed with that much pressure, it doesn't die, it germinates, it breaks through the dirt, and it grows into something strong enough to crack concrete. Clara Jennings was no longer just surviving the harvest. She owned it. Clara Jennings didn't just beat a rigged system, she completely rewrote the rules of modern farming, from the brink of foreclosure and corporate sabotage to building a multi-million-dollar organic milling empire. She proved that sometimes the biggest rejections are just the universe pushing you toward your true destiny. By cutting out the corrupt middlemen and trusting her own relentless grit, she turned worthless grain into absolute gold. If Clara's incredible fighting spirit inspired you, make sure to hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs a reminder to never back down, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life stories of triumph.